Hello, my name is Bob Edwards, and I'd like to talk to you today about what I find when I read the Bible regarding the role of women in the church. And I've been a social worker for about 16 years and also had the privilege of being a Bible college professor for 4 years. And so what I'd like to do is share some of the things that I've discovered during that time. When I read the Bible, I see, first of all, that men and women were created equally in the image of God. And you can find this in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. You can also see in the book of Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, that men and women were given stewardship over all creation equally. Further, you can see in the book of Judges that God appointed a woman by the name of Deborah to be a ruler over Israel. Then as you move into the New Testament, you can see that women are deacons. In Romans chapter 16, verse 1, there's a woman named Phoebe who is a deacon and a leader in the church, according to Romans 16, verse 2. You also see in Romans chapter 16 mention of a woman named Junia, who was an apostle. Further, you see that a woman named Priscilla was a teacher of the gospel, and in fact she taught a man named Apollos the way of Jesus more accurately, is what the Bible tells us. You can find that in the book of Acts. The Bible also explains that women in the early church were prophets. So, women were clearly able to lead and teach and prophesy and were created equally in the image of God and were equally given stewardship over all creation. That paints a very egalitarian picture of men and women. I was very puzzled, therefore, to learn that some church traditions and denominational standpoints do not seem to support this picture of equality between men and women. You can find, for example, in some churches that women are not allowed to teach. Sometimes women are not allowed to preach. Other times they're not allowed to hold positions of leadership. And when I would compare those doctrinal positions or religious traditions to what I read in the Bible, as I say, I was puzzled by that. At times I was also quite troubled. When I was teaching, for example, at the Bible college, some of my most gifted students were men and some of my most gifted students were women. And unfortunately, some of the women who would have made excellent pastors, ministers, teachers, and preachers were not allowed to fulfill these roles because their particular church tradition or denominational position simply didn't allow it. And what really troubled me was when at times they're called to be ministers for the gospel. It really bothered me when that call was interpreted as a deception that came not from God but rather from the devil. So I began a 5-year research project to try to understand why, on one hand, the Bible seems to portray men and women as equals, and the Bible is very clear about women holding positions of teaching and leadership in the church, but on the other hand, some church traditions don't seem to support that. And what I discovered was both enlightening and disturbing. It seems that the Christian church became a very Roman institution. And Rome was an extremely patriarchal culture, and some of the prominent theological writers of that century seemed to merge the patriarchy of their Roman culture with Christian theology. And some of the more well-known theologians who did this would be, of course, St. Augustine and also St. Jerome. Now, St. Augustine, one of the quotes I found from him, he said that it was was essentially a woman's place in life to serve men, particularly wives were expected to serve husbands. His reasoning was that women were intellectually and morally inferior to men, and so because of this they required male leadership and supervision. Now, that's not anything that I could find in the Bible, and I think anyone would be hard-pressed to find a Bible verse that says women are intellectually and morally inferior to men. No, I think that St. Augustine is getting that from his Roman culture, which unfortunately did hold that viewpoint. In fact, that viewpoint was even evident in Roman law. When women were blamed, in fact, when Rome was losing a Punic War, and the Senate decided that in order to change their fortunes, they needed to place stricter controls on women to appease the gods so that the gods might grant them victory. So women were typically vilified and demeaned, frankly, in Roman culture, and St. Augustine seems to have been strongly influenced by this. He also seems to have been influenced by his fascination with Greek philosophy, particularly Plato's philosophy. And Plato viewed the mind as superior to the body. He looked at things in a very dualistic light, and you can see evidence of this also in St. Augustine's writing. What's really unfortunate is that St. Augustine seems to take his Roman cultural lenses and his familiarity with Greek philosophy and see the Bible from that perspective. For example, he said that men, or the husband, in the Bible stands for the mind or the spirit, and women stand for the flesh, or the lower part of human nature. So just as the spirit or the mind needs to rule over the body, men need to rule over women. Now again, this isn't a concept that you can find in the Bible, but you can find it in Plato's philosophy, and it's certainly reinforced by Roman culture. Now, what really troubled me was that some of the verses in the Bible at around the 3rd century and afterwards seem to actually have been altered to fit St. Augustine's patriarchal worldview. For example, I mentioned earlier that there are verses in Romans chapter 16 that refer to Phoebe as a deacon. Well, later in church tradition and Bible translation, this word has been changed from deacon or minister to servant. And you can find examples of this in the King James Version of the Bible. But the earliest Greek manuscripts refer clearly to Phoebe as a deacon, and that word, when it's used of men, is consistently translated, or most frequently translated, either deacon or minister. In fact, the term's used of the Apostle Paul. Also in Bible translation, later in church history, you may remember that I mentioned that Junia was an apostle. Well, later on, her name was changed to the name of a man, which would obscure the fact that indeed a woman was an apostle and leader in the early church. So, the Bible presents a very clear picture of women and men created equally. It presents clear evidence of women being leaders in the Old Testament and New. It presents clear evidence of women not only leading but teaching. And frankly, some church traditions don't allow these things to take place. They characterize women, sadly, as though they are somehow less spiritual than men, as though they are somehow inferior, more prone to error, and requiring male supervision to prevent them from falling into sin or leading the church astray. And what I found as I conducted my research is that this notion does not have its origin in the Bible. In fact, it has its origin in the writings of St. Augustine when the church became a Roman institution. St. Augustine, St. Jerome, and others. And what I would encourage Christian leaders to reflect on now is whether or not their doctrinal position is an accurate reflection of God's heart and mind towards women, or if it is a reflection of prejudice that has its origin not in the Bible or in God's mind, but in a very patriarchal human culture. And my hope is that anyone who is listening to this message will recognize that if you're male or female, God created you equally in His image. God loves you, and any prejudice towards you does not have its origin in God or in the Bible. And so I think I'd also like to point out that there is a mention of men ruling over women in the Bible, in the book of Genesis. But this occurs only in chapter 3 of Genesis, and the context, I think, of the verse is extremely important. If you don't look at the context of Bible verses, you can essentially use them to make any point you wish to make, whether it's accurate or not. And the context of the verse that talks about men ruling over women describes it as a curse. Describes it as a consequence of humanity turning from God. It's a consequence of what's referred to typically as the fall of humanity into sin. And so as a result of people turning away from God, turning to sin, one of the unfortunate consequences of that is this curse that men will be inclined to rule over women. When we look at the New Testament, the book of Galatians, chapter 3 specifically, we see the gospel's response to this curse. We're told specifically that Jesus Christ took this curse upon himself when he went to the cross, and that he did this so that we could be set free from it. Later on in Galatians chapter 3, we read that as a result of Jesus taking this curse upon himself, there is now neither Jew nor Greek, slave or free, male or female, because we are all one in Jesus. So the Bible is very clear that men are not to rule over women. The Bible is very clear that men and women are created equally. Women can exercise their gifts fully in God's service, and that anything contrary to that is not God's will. It is in fact a curse that Jesus himself died to free us from. So my hope is that anyone listening to this will be encouraged by that and not feel bound by this curse or ancient prejudices that may be maintained by church tradition. For those of you who might be interested in investigating this topic further, I wrote a book about gender equality in the church. It's entitled Let My People Go, Call to End the Oppression of Women in the Church. It's available on Amazon.com and Amazon.ca. It's also available at www.equalityforwomeninChrist.com. I hope people benefit from this message, and thank you for listening.